Developers, 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 developers. Developers, 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 developers. Yes!
Welcome to Developers, our developer experience live stream where we talk about developer tools, and now recently have been interviewing influential people in developer experience. My name is Ian Jennings. This is Cristian Heilmann, and today we have Chris Heilmann. And Chris, you work with Microsoft Edge, right?
Yeah, I work on the developer tools in Microsoft Edge, and especially the integration with Visual Studio Code.
Oh, very cool.
It suddenly makes me realize we stole this this show name from a famous former Microsoft employee.
I never heard that story, and I also get never tired of hearing that story. I think we should repeat it.
It's fairly well known. No one's sued us yet, so it's okay.
Well, when I saw the title about DevX 5, I just remembered like DivX 5, like when you did like totally legal copies of the DVDs that you bought, and you've used that codec to actually. I was thinking about that one first, not about the developers bit.
Yeah. Well, I think it all works. I actually remember that now. I think I might even still have a few DVD rips lying around. AVI and DivX, like formats you just don't really see anymore. That's a previous life. Let's move on to the future, where everything is browser-based, which is kind of an appropriate topic. Tell us a little bit. I've actually met you a bit in the past at events and things, and you've kind of had a little bit of a path along kind of related-ish roles at other companies. So tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are now.
Well, I'm Chris, and I've always been I always loved computers. As a kid, I was really excited about everything computer animated on television, and like Star Wars and these kind of things. So, and Star Trek mostly, actually, rather than Star Wars, because there was real science in there. And then I got into computers, and I basically started writing like basic programs and little things for myself. And then I started writing, playing computer games, and realized I'm rubbish at it. And then I realized I'm actually quite good at finding out how I can have endless lives and turn collisions off in the games and stuff like that. So I learned programming by reverse engineering games. And then writing my own games as well. And as a profession, I actually started as a radio journalist. I actually was a newscaster at a radio station. And then I got into, I think in 1997, I did my first website that I sold for somebody else, like a solicitor who still doesn't know that he has a website, because back then he asked me what the telephone number of his website is. He just heard that he needed a website, and I was the one person in the area that could do it. So then I started working as a freelancer for BMW and worked on their intranet. And after I had that on my CV, I started working for several agencies before I ended up in Yahoo, in eToys first. eToys moved to America for a few months and worked for them there. And then when they went bankrupt, I had to move to England from Germany, because I couldn't go back because the office in Germany didn't exist. So I moved to England, and that was in 2000. And then I stayed in England for 16 years, working for eToys first, and for Agilicis, doing things like the Visit Britain website, McDonald's UK for a few years as the main engineer. Then I went to Yahoo as a lead engineer. There I actually realized I can't get promoted anymore. So I invented the role of developer evangelist, which was great because it actually mixed my background in journalism with the code, with the programming stuff, and wrote a handbook on developer evangelism that actually got really, really used by a lot of people out there. And when Yahoo closed the UK office, then I started working for Mozilla and worked on Firefox and then Firefox OS. And then when Microsoft approached me, after approaching me several times actually in the past, and I could never be bothered, they said that they have a new browser and they want to remove Internet Explorer. And I'm like, yes, that's what I wanted to do from the very beginning as a web developer. And then took the opportunity and worked on as an evangelism person on the Edge team, rolling out the new Edge browser. The one that was not Chromium based yet. And then when we moved to Chromium, I actually spearheaded that one as well. With my background in open source from Mozilla side, it was a great opportunity to actually work on a big open source project and actually replace the browser that comes with Windows with something that people wanted. And now I'm super excited about being a principal program manager in the tools team, working on the developer tools and also on the integration with other IDEs like Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio. And I think it's an exciting space to be in, because I worked as a developer on the web, then I worked on browsers, and now I work on tools for developers. So I know what people want, what I always wanted, and now I got the power to do it. And I'm really excited about that opportunity. I think there hasn't been a space right now where it's amazing what we do, because the tools that we write are also in the same languages. We're writing TypeScript, JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, and we're building Visual Studio Code with that. And I tweeted it the other day where I just showed the thing that I was working on right now, and I was like, as a web developer, this would have been science fiction for me when I started. And Zeltman retweeted it and said the same thing. And it's so cool that the web has become really the platform, not only for content distribution, but also for creation. So it's exciting to see that.
Yeah. So when you say just to go back quite a jump, just because something you said, when you say you created Developer Evangelist, do you mean you created the name or just at Yahoo?
At Yahoo, I think the first ones to use it were Apple and Microsoft as well. And I just gave at Yahoo back then, in the back end, you could name your own, you can change the title of your job. And I just changed it to Developer Evangelist, and then people started asking me what it is, and then I wrote the handbook for it. So it kind of like, I found myself in a place where I didn't want to get into management, and I didn't want to go into people management, and I didn't want to be like the gray eminence in the corner that's like the software architect that nobody listens to. So I thought I find a hybrid space, and we didn't have that back then in Yahoo yet. So that's when we rolled out the Yahoo User Interface Library and also the YDN platform and all the stuff. Yeah. And it's really exciting times. So I think it's a general good advice for anybody in our job. When you're bored with your job role, there's always opportunities in the companies that you stay in if you still believe in the company. And if you don't believe in the company, then just leave. I've had so many times where I stayed in jobs where I thought, I worked on a project for 3 years that was going nowhere. And I thought, next month, they're going to give me the opportunity to fix it. Next month, we're going to get the right tooling in place. It will never happen. And you're so tainted by that, that you're not going to be helpful to the product either anymore. So it's probably a good idea to move on and do something different, or coach somebody else to do it for you and go into a different role. That's what I did back then.
I'd just like to ask one more very quick follow-up question about the book, and then I'll let Ian say something. So I just noticed you released a new version of it in 2 years ago, after 11 years. What are kind of some of the highlights of things that changed in that period of time?
I think a lot of it, what changed was that it was fledgling social media at the beginning. Like, I explained how to use Twitter, and I explained how to use these kind of things. And that whole market has been steamrolled by like growth hacking and all kind of crap. So the amount of time back then that you actually were a technical voice on Twitter and you had success because of that is kind of over, because everything is like completely machine orientated and algorithm orientated by now. So it's kind of trickier. And the other bits that I changed a lot was mostly talking more about video and talking less about going to conferences, because that's when COVID hit as well. And I realized that my whole world changed and my computer setup changed. So out of a sudden, I wasn't only working on a laptop, I was working on 2 screens, and I was working with the computer at home, and it felt completely different to me. I also did a Skillshare course on that, like how to set up your environment for hybrid project work and hybrid office work, because it was interesting when nobody else could travel and everybody had to stay at home and was quarantined. Out of a sudden, my knowledge of working from home and on the road for 10 years was gold, because people were completely confused. They didn't know how to deal with it. And I had done it for 10 years. I always had like my little corner. I mean, the the book that I've the first JavaScript book that I wrote in 2006, I actually wrote on the tube, because every morning I would go from Finsbury Park, where I lived in northeast London, and go to Hammersmith in southwest London. So it was 1 hour on the train, and there was nothing to do. And I wrote my first book on the tube, on the underground. And that's how much I got used to just having my heads down and using my computer wherever I am. And a lot of people are like, how can you do this? I get so distracted when I'm at home. I cannot concentrate. And I really got into that mindset rather early on and explained to people how to do it as well. So it was pretty nice.
So it looks like now you're a program manager. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah. How does that relate? Is that like another tier above developers, like relations? Have you sort of like abstracted yourself one layer above?
It's more it's different than that. I think it was just an opportunity, or actually it was a necessity. One of the program managers in the team, in the developer tools team, actually left the company, and they didn't have anybody at the moment who could fill in quickly. So they asked me if I could do it. And I originally wasn't excited, because you're owner of a product out of a sudden. You're not owner of a message like you are with DevRel.
Yeah.
And you're focusing on one product mostly. And but to a degree, as soon as I started it, especially started working with the team that I have right now, which is incredible, and just beautiful, amazing developers that focused on one thing for a long, long time and know it inside out. So that was really exciting for me to have that opportunity, and also coach these engineers and these other PMs to actually get more out there, bring the DevRel into the PM role rather than just having a dedicated DevRel. So to me, it was a learning as well, like to learn about OKRs and to learn about goals and to learn about not publishing things as soon as I find them, but actually let them simmer a bit and make them work before we talk about them. That's still a problem that I have, but I think it's a normal problem of our market. But I think the product manager role is an interesting one to go get older in as well. Because the other thing about DevRel is it's really stressful. It's really a lot of work to do. I mean, especially when you did it like me. I had like 30 conferences a year. I was never at home. I was just traveling all the time. And I was just chasing the next talk to be written rather than just doing anything and producing anything myself except for demos. And sooner or later, you feel like you want to do more coding again. You want to do more writing again. And the PM role was quite interesting in that case to go back into, especially when you're in my case now, I'm a principal PM. So my job is to think about the next 5 to 6 years. What are we going to do? Where are we going to go with the product, and not like what the product day-to-day delivery is. So that's an exciting place to be in, I think.
And that, I mean, it's definitely the sorry, forgive the pun, it's definitely the cutting edge. Because I have this love-hate relationship with how complicated browsers have become, because I'm a bit old school and kind of like having proper applications and things like that. But at the same time, I love Visual Studio Code. And it's interesting you say they are effectively kind of have, I guess, I mean, I don't know if this is actually technically true, but they obviously have some very similar underpinnings. But I'd like to go back a step again before we get to the kind of Microsoft specifics. And Edge is now built on top of Chromium. And I'm interested to know, when you have Chromium and its kind of very well-known sibling, I suppose, and you then build on top of something like that, how do you decide what you're going to add on or take away or inherit, et cetera, into something that is, widely used in a lot of places? Like, how do you decide what sort of special stuff you're going to add to your project?
I mean, from the very get-go, we said we're not going to build on top, but we're going to build with it. We basically, the first year, almost everything that we put in there, we put back into the Chromium core, and we were contributors together with Chrome, together with Google, together with Samsung and all the other people that play in the Chromium space. And we said, we want to make that better and we want to make it different. So we want to make sure that we actually we're contributing to it rather than just building on top of it. We didn't fork it and do something on our own because that makes no sense. It's a well-established open source project. It has a lot of players in it. A lot of things are dependent on it. Our idea was by taking on Chromium and contributing to it, we not only make the browsers better, we also make the Electron platform better. We make the CDP, the Chromium development platform better. And with that, also Visual Studio Code and a lot of GitHub stuff that we're doing right now. The node infrastructure became better because we started thinking about JavaScript and thinking about V8 as well, rather than having our own Chakra JavaScript engine. So the idea was from the very get-go to contribute everything back. Where we differentiate, and Google also differentiates, is on UX elements and also how the browser functions and services of the browser. Like translation in the browser is never going to be open source because it costs a lot of money and it's different engines out there. Like image recognition in the browser, like the map services, the email services. No browser makes money. In essence, you make money by showing ads in search results, or you make money with the services that you provide around the browser. And it's always quite funny how geeks get super excited when they say like, oh, people use Chrome because Chrome was Chromium. And I'm like, I'm quite sure you also used Chrome because you used Gmail and you used Google Maps. You know, that this is how we get into things. The same way people use Safari because they have an iPhone device. I've been using a Mac for 10 years. I still have Mac as my main computer, but I haven't used Safari ever. I'm just not that kind of developer. I go to the terminal first. But most other people that use the browser that comes on the operating system, they don't care what it is. It's the thing that brings me to the internet. So the idea was to bring back into Chromium what we need, and that way make all the browsers better. And we totally agreed. We totally knew we're not going to take something from 10 years of involvement of lots of people and build on top of it. It makes no sense. We have to bring it back. And it was exciting to see that. I mean, not many people realize that, but a company like Microsoft, and I'm quite sure the BBC, Samsung, other people as well, especially those that have ties to government contracts as well, have very defined ways how we can create software. So nothing that goes out of the door at Microsoft can be inaccessible. Everything has to be accessible to screen reader users. Everything has to be localizable. So one of the first things we did, rather than fixing a ton of bugs in the developer tools and in the browser engine itself, is also make it keyboard accessible, make it screen reader accessible, make it translatable, having different localizations, releasing it in different languages. So all of that got back into the platform, and all the other browsers now benefit from that one as well. And we're going to do a whole story about this because I'm a huge accessibility fan. I think it's very important that everybody in the world actually needs to have access to the stuff that we do. But at the same time, it's quite funny when it comes to compliance, when you have to make everything accessible. The other day, I spent 4 hours making a color picker accessible to screen reader users. And of course, not all screen reader users are completely non-sighted. Some of them are just like have bad eyesight or something. But I don't see anybody with bad eyesight jumping on a color picker as the first thing to do. So it kind of feels sometimes weird how you have to make things compliant and make them accessible. And it makes sense to make them accessible, but the use case just isn't there. So it's quite fascinating to see how many times we go back and forth in the Chromium project as well. Once we made something accessible and it is a big code change and we bring it back to the platform, then there's discussions like how does it affect performance? How does it affect binary size and these kind of things? So I think it was exciting to build on top of the Chromium project, but with the Chromium project was much better. And one of the first things I did when I joined the DevTools team is actually take a train down to Munich, because that's where their team is, because our team always had to say like, oh, it takes so long for them to answer because they're 9 hours away. And I'm like, well, they're in the same time zone as me now. So I'm going to go down there and like had an introductory session, and we talked to each other, and we became a contributor to the project. And we also had like admin access in the beginning, where we could actually then change the project around from within rather than just committing it back to the owners and then hoping for them to sign it off or not. So it was a lot of back and forth and a lot of interesting things to go on to. And I think that's how open source should work. You should not just take something and just build on top of it, but you should contribute back every single time to it. Problematic is, of course, when it becomes then gatekeeperish, like when the original owners don't want to do anything with it, and you still have to do it. That's an issue. But I still think if you do something, then you should try to make it as open as possible yourself as well. And we're still, we not everything in Edge is open source. Not everything in Chrome is open source, but the Chromium platform is definitely open source. And it's something that is exciting. I'm currently I'm PMing the developer tools extension for Visual Studio Code, and that was from GitHub from the very get-go. Like all the issues coming in from users, everything we do there is published there, not only on our internal platform, but also there. And that was a blueprint for a lot of other things that will come in the near future, where we're doing more and more open source work in this environment as well. And I think without GitHub, this wouldn't have been a thing. I think a lot of people started open sourcing things since we had GitHub and also GitLab and all the other platforms out there, because I think I used every version control on this planet, like starting with SVN, CVS, StarTeam, Microsoft Visual Source Safe, Bazaar, all kind of things were horrible and terrible. And then Git came around, and it's still, to a normal person, it still looks like hieroglyphics, but to me, it makes a lot more sense than most of the other stuff that I had used before.
Oh, I've got lots of places I'd like to go, but Ian, I'm going to let you get a word in.
I want to hear more about the relationship between, I guess, specifically the Microsoft stuff, between, acquiring GitHub, VS Code blowing up. I had a friend ask me last night, what IDE do you use? And I'm like, it's VS Code now. Like, that's the only answer. And then also with this contrast of Edge, which still feels like it's fighting for its developer, credibility, and you're specifically on the Edge team, right? So or the Edge Dev Tools team in integration with VS Code. So I'm really curious to hear about beyond the technical implementation, what does that look like in the strategy and marketing and sort of overall mission, combining GitHub, NPM, and all this other stuff that's been going on at Microsoft.
Okay, that's a lot of questions. I always worked with the VS Code team, even when I worked on Edge itself, because I was a huge fan of it from the very beginning. And I also loved that it was open source from the very beginning. The biggest success story in Microsoft in open source, if you don't count Mono or something like that. And I think the interesting thing there is the GitHub I don't know much about it. I wish I knew more about it, because I'm actually a huge GitHub fan as well. I mean, especially GitHub Pages is so cool now. It's so easy to do nowadays. I don't bother anymore with my own server. I just basically put a domain on top of some GitHub pages and I'm done. Like the developer evangelism book, the new one is not hosted on my own server anymore, but it's actually on GitHub, and and people can contribute there, and it's much easier that way. In terms of marketing of Edge, I'm quite out of the loop as well, because I'm actually on the developer tools team, and that's where the open source bit works as well. I see a lot of VS Code going into merging with GitHub, and that's also you can see the strategy for quite a while with VS Code.dev and GitHub Codespaces. And I think that's just absolutely wonderful. I mean, you go to any GitHub repo, you press the full stop, and VS Code comes in your browser with that repository open for you immediately. And that's only possible because the editor itself is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It does a lot of the stuff that we do can't be done in an environment yet, because we're using CDP under the hood. So we're using file system access, and we're using services of the operating system as well. But we really want to integrate much more with that as well. One of the big things that I'm advocating for right now in the company is to actually have the developer tools more dependent on the domain that's open. We already have that. If you have a local host open right now, or you open a local file in Edge and you open the developer tools, it asks you for the folder that file is in and to get access to it. And that way, the developer tools, instead of having the editor in the developer tools that is kind of rudimentary by now compared to Visual Studio Code, if you have Visual Studio Code becomes the editor of the dev tools. So you do a CSS editing in the browser tools, and it will automatically change the file in Visual Studio Code for you. So none of these changes get lost any longer.
That's huge.
And we just released that for Sass and for React as well. Like if you do like abstractions, because that was another problem that hardly anybody writes CSS by hand anymore, except for me, it seems. But the other thing that I want to think about is like GitHub then, or VS Code.dev. Like if you're already in a development environment, and that kind of is interesting because it ties back to my DevRel times and my evangelism times, that I see engineers and developers as a great audience for browsers. But because, I mean, in the past, it was this like influencer thing, like you get a developer to love your browser and they will install it on computers of all their family and these kind of things. That's kind of gone. I think browser makers or like operating system makers are good enough to actually tell people about their browser nowadays. We don't go around and actually install computers anymore for our friends. Most computers come pre-installed and then we throw away it when the new one comes out. But the integration, me as a developer, when I'm known as a developer to the browser, there's so many opportunities there. Like if I have a GitHub account, why don't they have a different developer tool immediately? Or why can't my developer tool send me to GitHub? And this is something that I'm working on the next half year or my next year of evangelization of the developer tools inside the company. So I want to have more integration with the rest of the infrastructure that we have, which is GitHub, which is Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio Code.dev. it was interesting when GitHub got acquired because I was really happy about it, not because I worked for Microsoft, but because I was worried. I so much was dependent on GitHub. So much I did was dependent on GitHub, and it was a startup in San Francisco, and I know what happens to those. So I was really happy that somebody took it on, and the whole idea of GitHub for the enterprise didn't take off until actually the Microsoft name was associated with it, because then a lot of enterprise customers are basically saying, now I can trust it, and now I can actually use it as well. I mean, I work with German insurance companies that ask me about GitHub out of a sudden, and I'm like, that's amazing. You're not using Jira and like your own firewall and the server and your server farm that is the version control any longer.
Gerrit,
so that's pretty nice.
Seems to be the popular one in a lot of German enterprises, I remember.
So I think there is a lot of overlap what we have right now, and I don't think we see developers as users as much so far. I find it interesting that Firefox, for example, has an own dev developer edition of the browser, but I don't see the numbers that people are flocking to it yet. But that might be because, sadly enough, there is also a decline of Firefox usage. But I still think that that is the wrong way. I don't want to have like a browser that's different from that of my end users, because that way I get different results. I mean, it's bad enough that I have a Google phone and everything on Android is amazing. And then I use my Samsung phone, and out of a sudden, everything on Android is not as I expected it to be, because it doesn't have the same stock Android that turns everything on by Google already. I also have a Surface Duo as my company phone, and it's also running Android, but it has different results again. So I'm really excited about the opportunities for beginners and for people who are casual users of browser developer tools. You had that as one of the questions that we want to talk about, like how do we get feedback? And a lot of feedback is through GitHub issues, of course, in the products that I work on. But we also have the feedback icon in the browser itself, where people can press it. It takes a screenshot for you. It asks you if you want to send an email, and if you want to send the telemetry, so we actually know what happened, and then you can describe it. So my morning is basically going through those for my American colleagues, because we get about 4,000 a day. And I mean, it's 90% is random stuff that actually complains about the internet or about the browser, but some of it is then very actionable as well, and it's very exciting to see that. It's really frustrating when there is a simple problem that has been solved for a long time, but people didn't give me an email, so I cannot answer them. And I'm like, oh God, it's so easy to help you, but I don't know how to contact you. Because the developer tools have been growing immensely over the last 10 years, and there's a featureitis thing going on. Like, oh, somebody at a conference said it would be cool if it had that. Let's put that thing in there. And this was the only user of that product ever. Nobody else ever asked for that, and nobody else is going to use it. Like if I look at the telemetry of the developer tools right now, 2 of the 37 tools in there are being used. Like it's the Elements tab, it's the console, and that's basically it. Like the sometimes the application pane, the memory one, the performance one, but there's so much cool stuff in there that actually nobody knows about. So another thing that I'm working on right now is to bring the emulation bits more front and center, like bring them more into the browser than actually into the developer tools, because it makes sense to see any website in a mobile view. And you shouldn't be a developer and understand where in the developer tools the emulation pane is to actually get that sorted. We find a huge use case in the past was people using the developer tools to turn the browser into mobile emulation so they can upload images to Instagram, because the desktop website doesn't allow them to, but mobile allowed them to. So we find these use cases, and I'm like, this is nothing I need to do extra work for, but there's obviously a need there. So why don't we do something around that environment? So I think the biggest thing that I did in the last half year, or my OKR of this half year, was that story about getting from the browser to the IDE and to GitHub, and how can we work together and actually integrate better. And I think there's a lot of cool stuff coming down the line, and a lot of stuff we already made happen. I'm incredibly excited about the DevTools extension for Visual Studio Code, especially that you don't even need to load it any longer. You basically, if you go to Visual Studio Code and you start debugging on a local file on index.html or something, it asks you, do you want to run a browser? And then it runs Edge for you, and then there's the inspect button there. You click on the inspect button, and it installs the extension in the background for you. It asks you to install it, and then out of a sudden you got the developer tools in there. So you don't need to go to the marketplace to load it. You don't need to know the name of it. It just became part of the debugging experience. And I think that's the great thing. One of the best things that Visual Studio Code did, and that's why it bet all the other ones out there, that's why it became the most successful ones, is that it didn't build everything itself. It just did the most important thing. It built a platform. It did the editing bit right, and then it allowed you to write extensions for all the needs that you have in JavaScript. And that was basically why it became such a success. So integrating with VS Code was such a easy and wonderful experience. Also helpful that you're the same company, but it was much, much easier than doing everything else. I also integrated with Visual Studio, and that was exciting because I hadn't used it since 2001. So seeing the changes there and integrating with that environment was much harder than with Visual Studio Code, but that's because code is based on Chromium as well. You were twitching, Chris, so I was wondering.
No, there was like, first thing, it occurred to me, there's always been this, when I've shown sometimes people who are new to developer tools in browsers, and often when it's that little weird magic thing where you go and say, oh, look, we can just see what the website looks like with a different font or a different color, and you change it in the inspector, and people are like, oh, did that just change the website? Like, no. But now you're kind of thinking, well, actually, technically, it kind of could.
Since you own the ecosystem and you can get from GitHub to the front end, like I can make a change in the dev tool, like Chris is saying, and it actually can commit to the source all through Microsoft products, essentially, because we own that whole ecosystem. So that's a real fascinating picture, especially like as the space of dev tools is growing, and there are so many individual components now spreading out. And meanwhile, Microsoft is kind of taking like obviously the suite approach, where it's like, well, yeah, what if you press dot? What do you like GitHub Codespaces on any web page? Right? You press dot on a web page, it forks it, and then like you change the page and publish it on GitHub Pages or something. I don't know. It's a really, really interesting picture. It makes me want to buy Microsoft stock. Right.
It is fascinating how much of that feedback I get every single day is people thinking we have these godlike powers. 60% of that feedback is like, I uploaded this image to some random social media company in Taiwan. It's the wrong picture. Can you please remove that?
Yeah.
And you're like, no, we can't. But it feels such a powerful thing. I mean, I don't know if you remember Grease Monkey. It was this Firefox extension that allowed you to write little JavaScripts to change websites. And I used that back then to do prototyping for customers. So instead of doing like screenshots and changing them in Photoshop, I just basically wrote a bit of JavaScript to change their live website around and showed them what it could look like. And it was really powerful in pitches. And then they asked me when it's live, because it's obviously done already, right? And you're like, no, I just overrode what you've done. I don't have access to your server. I cannot access it on the source. But it's exciting to see that people think that's so powerful. And I think years ago, Mozilla had this wonderful extension that also allowed you to just change any website by making content editable on the body and then changing the delta for you and putting it somewhere. And it was great for kids to just play around and put images into a website and then like, oh, look, I put a picture of a cat on BBC. Great. And I think that's still a great thing for the web. But I really hope that the web still exists that way, because if you look at the traffic of the web, it's like 90% is like Facebook and other closed platforms rather than that. And if you look at the HTML of Facebook or Twitter, it's not even HTML any longer. It's just it's a conversion goal, a conversion target. I mean, it's all like divs and classes that are unreadable and actually that have a checksum. So if you do the developer tools, you change something around in them, it actually invalidates it and reloads it as well. So it's basically what people wanted in 997. I mean, every customer I had in 997 was like, oh, I want to go on the web, but I don't want people to be able to save my images and to copy my text. You're like,
obfuscation tools,
keep your website on a USB stick in your desk. That's the only way how to stop people from using it. It was really fascinating to see that this is not there. But you're right that the infrastructure is there to actually make the web editable and make it forkable for everybody is a very, very interesting experience. Also,
are you fighting that fight? Like, are you?
Oh yeah.
Is that the, like, in the advocacy and the accessibility and democratization? Like, is that where we're headed, or are we just like in our fantasy land thinking that, are we fighting that for that last 10% stake?
No, my biggest mantra is that developer tools as they are right now are expert tools, and I hate that. I don't want a tool to be a gatekeeper. I want you to become a better developer by using the tool over time. That's why I'm super excited about inline linting in VS Code, for example, with our extension. Like if you type an image in there without an alternative text, it gives you a squiggly line under it, much like in Word, and explains to you what you've done wrong or what you could do better. So rather than just allowing people to write code and then have another tool do the testing for them or a test department doing it, you can find out while you're actually coding that you're making mistakes and how to do things better. And I think that's a very exciting thing, which brings me, of course, to GitHub CoPilot, which is just nuts.
I maintain a linting extension for VS Code, actually. So I have built around that the underpinnings you have. But also I have tested GitHub CoPilot and done a couple of videos on it. And I was pleasantly surprised. I even tried doing creative writing with it. And actually, it wasn't terrible.
It is. I love that it not only gives you random stuff from the web. I mean, I always talked about the full Stack Overflow developer, which basically is like you go to Stack Overflow, you copy and paste and change some numbers around, which is 90% of the job what we do. And GitHub CoPilot automated that, but it does it better than that. I find that it actually learns from my coding style as well. So the way I've written things, and I saw it the other day, I just put a key handler on something and it wrote the rest of the code for like 2 tabs. And I was like, this is nuts. I've been doing that. I've been discovering that I've been writing the same code for about 15 years over and over again. And just the system learning from that. And this to me is an interesting space, that it happens in the code space. Because on the UI space, we don't do it as much yet. I would love to have, like, when you do something 5 times, that the system tells you, like, by the way, you keep doing that. Do you want to have a button that does that for you? Like to automate that way, much like the ribbon in Word or in PowerPoint only gives you the tools that are important at that time for that task that you're doing. And most of the developer tools are still this like kitchen sink of everything in one interface, and we hope you find what you're looking for, instead of just giving you what you need at the time when you need it. And I think that's an exciting environment. Of course, there's privacy concerns. There's also issues that not everybody wants to have their code analyzed as they're typing it in. So there's always an option to turn it off. That's a good thing. But it's interesting to see how many, and I love how people are very much adamant to tell you that as Microsoft every single time you release something. If it's a little startup in the Silicon Valley that does the same thing, everybody sees this innovation rather than as intrusion. But it's an interesting thing they keep us on our toes that way. So it's really good to see. But yeah, GitHub CoPilot is a very interesting idea, and I've been dabbling in in machine learning in between. I gave a lot of talks about the ethics of machine learning and like also where we should go with it. And this is that's what I think 2 years ago I talked about that, and I'm like, wouldn't it be cool if that was the thing? And then GitHub released it a month later, and I'm like, oh my God, they did it, and that's just impressive. That's really nice to see.
It's actually very interesting because we go back to the whole owning the ecosystem thing, because I also tried JetBrains' alternative, and it does not do as good a job because they don't have access to the GitHub underpinnings. This is the interesting
Oh, do you mean
thing.
the data set? Because the codex is the same. Like it also uses OpenAI as well, doesn't it?
I don't know. I when I was trying it with writing stuff, it frequently, like with GitHub CoPilot, it kind of seems to read what I'm writing and then compare it to other things, whereas the JetBrains one was just kind of always seemed to be in isolation. I don't know. It's earlier stages as well. I'm not sure of but it's one of the main things I noticed is it seemed to have no real context of what I was doing a lot of the time. Whereas CoPilot
I haven't used it,
did.
so I don't know. But it's I mean, GitHub CoPilot, I was lucky to be in there from the very beginning, and it was it's gotten better and better. And like, yeah, of course, it's easy to find the flaws in it. Like every time you do machine learning, it's easy to point out that there's obvious problems with it. And there was a lot of I like the discussion about licensing as well. Like if that code can really be used, but in essence, we're not implementing it. You still have to press tab and put it in there. And it would be a possibility to flag it up and put a comment in there and say where it came from or whatever. You could work around that issue. But I mean, I don't see people copying and pasting things into Stack Overflow as answers either. And just, I mean, nobody does it in social media. Like every meme is basically stolen, and nobody puts behind the license behind it. So I wish we could do a better job at that, and it's going to be interesting in the nearer future. But if you really think that your career as a developer is like the 10 lines of code that you put in there is going to be giving you royalties for the rest of your life, I got bad news for you. I mean, it's not going to be a thing.
This article from last November around developer tools secrets shouldn't be secrets, which apparently was very popular on Hacker Noon as well. And it kind of intrigued me because what you said earlier as well about the dev tools, and I'm guilty of this myself, in that you tend to just use a very small percentage of what's there. And then the one that really jumped out of me that I really learned from this post was, I'm not the world's best programmer. I program kind of more for entertainment and for scratch my own itches, not for commercial purposes. And I saw this whole thing about, console.log is not the only thing you could do, which I never actually realized. So these kind of like interesting little features that do exist in these tools, and how much do you inform developers that these could make their experience better without throwing it in their faces? This kind of discoverability of features that will help them, but if you show everyone everything, it makes it impossible to navigate. And how do you get that balance right? And I think this also feeds into that smartness a little bit as well, which we don't have. But yeah, the fact it takes a blog post to point a lot of them out is kind of interesting in itself. And yeah, what's in terms of your program manager role, like how? I guess the answer is the word I can't seem to pronounce.
Teletubbies, yeah.
Yeah, that one, yes. It's like, how do you kind of surface these things that would help people, but there's so many other things that could also help them. So how do you improve that discoverability, I guess?
It's an interesting one because that was a fallout from a talk that I've given, and the talk was a fallout from the documentation that I've written on the developer tools. Like one of the big things we've done to the developer tools as Microsoft as well is that we documented everything for the first time in docs.microsoft.com and not in 50,000 blog posts on 20,000 different blogs, which was the case with the developer tools over the years because it was 10 years in the making and just people some things went away, some things went around. Some video courses were out there. A lot of people basically making money with explaining developer tools to other people, which is good too. But it's kind of sad that this is the state. That's why it was the title as well, that these things shouldn't be secrets, and that actually they should be pretty obvious. So the first thing we did was like document everything. And that doesn't work because people don't RTFM, even no matter how good the M is. And the problem there is that what we found, especially in the developer tools extension, that's why we tried that out, is in context help is actually useful. That you have links inside the tool itself saying like, what is this? And people can click on it and it points them to the docs then. And it does these kind of things. We have a new thing called focus mode that's rolling out right now in Edge Dev and Edge Canary, as like 50% of the people will see it, which is basically a new interface on top of the developer tool. So instead of getting this old interface that we have right now, that we all think is great because it's a Stockholm syndrome of interfaces. We're not used to anything else. Everything looks like Firebug in 1997. 2001. Like we just learned that paradigm and just put it in there. There's hardly any tab interfaces in modern interfaces any longer, but everything there is still tabs and panels. So we have a right-hand navigation with icons that actually show you tools according to task. So instead of having like all the things shown at the same time, you say like, oh, I don't want to do I just want to do CSS editing, and then you only see two of the pieces in there. Other things that I'm trying to do is what I talked earlier, to bring, for example, the emulation more front and center into the main browser, and that way bring in the developer tools in there. I mean, right now you can right-click on anything in a website. You can take a screenshot of it. You can translate it. You can create a QR code from the URL, which I don't know why that's in there, but anybody wanted it. That's why it's in there, I guess. But why not edit this? I mean, you can inspect, but you cannot directly edit, or you cannot directly overlay it. So I want to cut the developer tools up into lots of distinct little pieces, much like VS Code, and integrate them into different environments rather than just having them as this one monolithic thing you have to turn on. So that's one thing that we're trying to do. With the console thing, I was also considering like, how could we make the console cleverer? If you do console log of an array, why don't we automatically do a console table for you? Because it is tabular data, and it would make so much more sense to display it that way, but you don't know about console table. So probably it would be the first time you do it, it shows you, did you know there's console table as well, and show it to you there. So that's one thing to flag up new features. It's really hard to be loud about it and to actually get people excited about the things. What we do a lot is also start with research, start with user research and see what problems we have. We're incredibly lucky that we're a huge company. So for example, one of the big differentiators we had in developer tools, which we didn't bring back to Chromium right now for, I don't know, anyways, we didn't, is that we talked to the Office team, and they had the Office Online and what kind of problems they found. And they found that they had like all these elements that basically are not in the DOM any longer, but still use up memory, but no tool would tell you what they are. So we built this detached elements product for them, that little thing, a little tab, a new one in the developer tools, and they used it internally, and we made all of our products much faster and much less memory consumption because of that, even including Teams. And that's because that's again an Electron app inside it, so you could use that tool in there as well. And then we just released it as part of the developer tools as well, because we realized people out there might be excited about it as well. But telling people about it is like, yeah, you can write the blog post, you can write the tweet, you can do the videos, but people will forget about it again and go back into the thing. And that's one of the big things that we're wondering about right now. I don't want a Clippy in developer tools that tells you it looks like you're doing this and that, should I help you? But short of that, I think there is the in-context help thing is an interesting bit. The other thing that the focus mode will have in the nearer future as well, there's still a lot of architecture problems with that in terms of performance, is that you will have a question mark that you can click on, and then you can hover around all the tools in the developer tools and explains to you what they are and links to the documentation. And in my perfect world, it will also show you a video of how it's done and how to deal with it. So that way, I think a lot of like video editing software and other things do that, like these walkthroughs when you install them for the first time. And I think that's something that as developer tools have become so complex, it's a thing that actually is there. But there will always be a power user thing out there. I mean, the 2 days ago, I tweeted about that thing I found in preview in macOS.
Yeah,
I didn't know that macOS has, if you hit the backtick button, you get like a little lens. And I've used it for 12 years. And I've just found that out because I wanted to hit
added
escape.
a lot of those features recently, though, so don't feel too bad. Those are quite recent features.
But this is the great thing. You can still write a blog post or a tweet about this, and people get super excited about it. And it shows me just how much we don't know. And it kind of disheartens me that there's so much work and effort going into putting these things together, and then people not finding them and not using them. And
sometimes it's intentional. I don't know. There used to be a concept I learned at university around this kind of abstraction of complex things, and like people, for precisely the reason you described, people sometimes love it when they do discover it. If you don't tell them, they will never discover it. Sorry, if you do tell them, they won't discover it. And it's people like, "Ooh, I'm really clever. I just discovered this thing." It's like, and 10,000 other people, but still, you felt happy about it.
Well, it's the same. It's the same with like when I explain something to somebody else. They might understand it. If I help them understand it themselves and discover it themselves, they're gonna retain it 10 times better, because it's gonna be on their own terms and in their own way of learning. So it's, I mean, when I did my training courses as a trainer, it was basically always like, don't tell people information, lead them on the way, light the way for them, and remove the barriers of entry, and then let them find their own solutions. I did that in JavaScript courses as well, when I had like, instead of telling people my solution, I spent the first half hour just asking them to come up with solutions, and moved around the tables and looked over people's shoulders. And I learned so much from that as well, because everybody finds different ways to solve the same problem. And I think that's where it gets exciting. And that's where something like GitHub CoPilot is interesting as well, because it showed me some things in CSS that I had forgotten about or I didn't know about. And then I started looking them up. Another big thing is also the integration with documentation in the system. So what we did with issues in the developer tools of the website. So instead of just telling you there's an error, we also show you which element it happened on. You can click it and it goes to the Elements tab and highlights that element for you. It gives you further links, and it actually pulls in data from MDN about like the quick explanation what it is, and also the browser compatibility. So that's another thing that a lot of people don't understand, that like in my CSS, if I write this now and I have the extension installed, it underlines it yellow and says like, that is not supported by Safari, by the way, in case you want to rely on it. And instead of people having to go to the web and go to MDN and search themselves, it makes so much more sense to have that in context while I'm programming. And that's something that are small things that make a huge difference. Another thing we just integrated is in console, we have a search button. So when you have an error in the console, and you basically, how many times did you copy and paste that arrow, go to a new tab in your browser and do a search with that error. And now we could just put an icon next to it, click on it, and it does the search new tab for you. So instead of having to do that awkward copy and paste from console, which never works the way you want to, it's much easier right now to do some search in that environment.
There's a lot here. I must admit, my Chromium browser, I am one of these Safari users for different reasons, but my Chromium browser is currently Brave. But I think on Monday I might go and install Edge again. So.
I do love being a Microsoft person that uses a Mac, because I get these weird, everybody has something to tell me. Like either it's people saying like, oh my God, there's a Microsoft guy using a Mac. And you're like, yeah, for the last 10 years, where have you been? Azure is basically independent of the platform. Yeah. We're not the Windows company only any longer kind of thing. I love my Windows machine as well. Windows 11 is really nice. And I love my Linux servers. I basically like all of them. But then the other side is then when I do an explanation, they're like, oh, you should be explaining it for Windows users because they're your audience. And when I then explain it for Windows users, I get people like, oh, you're the Microsoft guy. Obviously, you only explain it for Windows. You're like, oh, I can't win here. What's going on?
It's very true. All right, Ian, do you have anything final you want to add? Because there's a lot here, and I've been opening like dozens of tabs in the background of things to go look into.
Yeah, me too. I've been reading Hacker News comments and your posts and stuff in the meantime. Like I just think it's a really exciting time, and you've made a lot of good points about like developer education and like, again, democratizing development. And I think that there's like a hard balance between, like you're saying, like education and teaching people what they need to know, but then also knowing when it's time to show them the advanced tools. I taught a friend how to use the breakpoints, within DevTools like last week, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, like this is what I've been looking for, for weeks." But meanwhile, I use console logs, and I'm fine with it. Like I like that style. So it's, how do you identify that person and who that person is and who it's for? And you're like, I think like for development is like I think developers are the last power users of like computing technology. That's my theory, that we are like the few industries where we're using more than like one tool. Like we're not just in like Illustrator and Dropbox all day or Adobe Premiere or something. Developers are using like, 20, 30 tools. And to me, I think that's just an interesting problem. And like we're saying, we're generating a bunch of like more and more tooling. So kind of bringing it back is like now the hard problem. Like what is actually important and how do we link these things? So I'd rather be in this place now than when I was in the 90s trying to make websites and I didn't even know what Firebug was. And I was trying to write CSS with no dev tools. So I think we're overall in a better place, but it's the cohesive story again, I think is extremely interesting. And, especially your perspective from Microsoft, where there is this ecosystem approach. The perspective is great because, again, Chris and I have been doing this now for like almost 2 years, and we've been talking mostly about individual tools and startups and how this one, company is changing this aspect. And to get that broad opinion is it's very, very super cool, and you're kind of seem like you're in the center of this almost. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I totally love that we also have millions of users, that we basically, Edge comes with Windows, and it's the browser that comes with it. You don't have to download. And I think it's great that we have a story there that we can actually tie that in. It also just occurred to me that this is back to in 2004, 2006. I was all about like APIs and data APIs and building your website from like 20 different services. I wrote a book about this as well. And then everything went to pot. Everything terribly got away. Like none of these search APIs are available any longer. Most data APIs, the Twitter API is a joke by now, trying to get content out of Twitter. Like it used to be like this great Web 2 infrastructure of like put data on the web and have like small bits talking to each other. And I think with developer tools, especially CDP and the Chrome developer platform and the underlying architecture of it, we have kind of the same thing. I mean, VS Code to a degree is one editor with lots and lots of plugins that are maintained by other people and get information and data from somewhere else. Like the GitHub CoPilot gets the data from the OpenAI and puts it in there. So I think that end user dream that I had of a read-write web is to a degree happening right now in the developer space, and that's really nice.
I think that was a very nice spot to end. But that was a really interesting chat, and I definitely will keep all my tabs open for Monday morning. Or even maybe the weekend. Right. I don't know. Depends how enthusiastic I feel. So thank you very much for your time. Just work and or the blogs you've mentioned, where can people find more about you? ChristianHeilmann.com is the easiest. That's where everything is listed. And in terms of the, that's basically the best start. I've got all the links to all the stuff that I've done there, and just Microsoft Edge developer tools and the official documentation is where I've been writing everything. CodePoet on Twitter with the 8 at the number, CodePO8. And that's it. Sometimes I look into LinkedIn, but it's not often. Ian, over to you.
I actually found that I have been squatting a new Twitter handle for almost 20 years. And so now I'm not Ian Jennings on Twitter. I'm just Jennings, where the E is a 3. because and embarrassingly, this Twitter handle was full of tweets when I was 18. So I had to delete them, move the name over. Anyway, my Twitter handle now is Jennings, J3NNINGS. What about you, Chris?
I'm ChristianSchiller.com or at ChrisChinch on the aforementioned Twitter. I don't tweet as much as I used to. I don't know. It kind of, I don't know. My head's elsewhere. But it happens every now and then. So, and yeah, thanks very much for joining us.